Greetings and salutations, magical chemists. Let's talk about reaction mechanisms. Collision theory assumes that most reactions occur in a series of steps where one or more reactant particles collide. We call this series of steps the reaction mechanism. For example, here's an overall reaction where two NO2 particles combine with an F2 particle, forming two particles of NO2F. However, it is kind of unlikely that two NO2 particles and an F2 particle will all collide with exactly the right orientation to have that reaction happen all at once. Instead, collision theory suggests that this is going to happen in a series of two steps. In the first step, one NO2 particle will collide with the F2 particle, and it's going to produce, one of those NO2F particles and what we call an intermediate, a single fluorine atom. In step 2, that single fluorine atom is going to react with that second NO2 particle, producing our second molecule of NO2F. Each one of these single steps in the reaction mechanism is called an elementary step. It's important to realize that elementary steps occur exactly as they are written. They represent the chemical species that are directly interacting. In this particular reaction mechanism, a single fluorine atom is first made, but then it is immediately used up. So it turns out F by itself does not show up in the overall reaction. As I mentioned, this is called an intermediate. The key to recognizing an intermediate in a reaction mechanism is that the first time you see it, it will show up as a product in an earlier step, and then later it will be used up as a reactant. In this case, it was the first step and the second step because there were only two steps in the mechanism, but there can be mechanisms with more than two steps. Important caveat: when all elementary steps are added together, they have to add up to the overall balanced equation. Kind of like Hess's law. If you look at the example up above, you'll notice that if you are adding these two steps together, the F is a reactant and a product, so it's gone, and that leaves us with two NO2s, and then two NO2Fs, and of course the one F2. So I made it really messy, but that both steps do add up to produce the overall reaction. When talking about elementary steps, there is a term you need to know called molecularity. Now, the word sounds fancier than it is. It's really just talking about the number of molecules participating in a given elementary step. So a unimolecular step is one in which there's only one reactant particle. It could decompose, or it could collide with solvents or something, but basically only one reactant is present. As you probably guessed, bimolecular reactions would be an elementary step with two reactant particles. Termolecular is how we refer to basically anything with three reactant particles in an elementary step, but this is very rare. For that to happen, you need three particles simultaneously colliding with the correct orientation and sufficient energy. So the AP chemistry test does expect you to recognize if they give you two example reaction mechanisms, and one of them shows you a termolecular elementary step and the other one doesn't, you're supposed to be able to say, termolecular is really rare, that's not a good reaction mechanism. Now, when looking at rate laws for elementary steps, it turns out each step in the mechanism has its own activation energy and its own rate law. Now, I am sure you are 100% aware by now that the rate law and orders for an overall reaction must be determined experimentally. There is something crazy about the rate laws and orders of an elementary step. You can actually derive the rate law and orders of an elementary step directly from the stoichiometry of that elementary step. I know you're thinking, wait, but you told us specifically we can never use the stoichiometry of the overall reaction. It's true. You can never use the stoichiometry of the overall reaction to determine the rate law. But you can use the stoichiometry of the elementary step. So if we go back to that reaction we were considering before, if you were trying to figure out the rate law for this overall reaction, You can't say, oh, it's second order with respect to NO2 and it's first order with respect to F2. You don't know that. You have to go ahead and look at the experimental data. That is the only way to derive the rate laws and the orders. However, if we're looking at the reaction mechanism step by step, now we can use the stoichiometry. In the first step, you'll notice there's one NO2 particle and one F2 particle. So if we were writing the rate law for that step, we would say it is first order with respect to NO2 and first order with respect to F2. Notice that your rate constant gets a little K1 because it's the rate constant for step 1. It's not the entire rate constant. And the same thing would happen if you were looking at the second step. Once again, you are using the stoichiometry to determine the order. It feels shocking. Oops, quick typo. The rate law for step 2 should have K sub 2. Okay, let's summarize what we know. So starting with the elementary step, you can look at its molecularity and use that to determine the order with respect to each reactant. A molecularity of 1 is unimolecular. An elementary step with 2 reactants is going to be bimolecular. A molecularity of 3 is termolecular, but that is very, very rare. Okay, now let's take a look at how you can use the rate laws of the individual elementary steps to predict the rate law for the overall reaction. In a reaction mechanism, you will have different steps, and each step will be at different speed. Well, one of those is going to be the slowest, and that slowest elementary step is called the rate determining step, because it's the one that slows down the whole reaction. That's because product production cannot occur any faster than the slowest step. You can look at a reaction mechanism graphically and determine which step is going to be the rate determining step, because the slowest step is going to be the one that has the largest activation energy, or the largest peak. So to determine the rate of the overall reaction, you have to combine the rates of all the elementary steps up to and including the slowest step in the mechanism. In the diagram down below, you'll notice that the activation energy of the very first step, the difference from where the reactants start to the height of the peak, that's pretty big. The activation energy of the second step, not so much. And notice for the activation energy of the second step, you're only comparing from this starting point, the lowest that it got in between the two steps. So because step 1 has a higher peak, right, higher activation energy, that means a smaller rate constant, a slower step. So step 1 is the rate determining step. It determines the overall rate. So you can be expected to look at a graphical reaction mechanism, basically showing you the energy diagram with all the different bumps, and you're expected to figure out from that which would be the slowest step in the reaction mechanism, and thus the rate limiting step. Okay, let's see what kind of questions you might answer about this. Many times they will provide you with a reaction mechanism and ask you if it is a valid reaction mechanism for a given overall reaction and rate law. Well, if you want a validated reaction mechanism, there are 2 things you have to check. First, when you add up all the elementary steps, they must sum to the overall reaction. And second, the rate law predicted from the reaction mechanism must be consistent with the experimentally observed rate law. The key to explaining this on a free response, because yes, these are common free response problems, is that you need to relate the coefficient from the balanced rate determining step to the order with respect to each reactant in the rate law for the overall reaction. Basically, you've got to look at the exponents of the rate law. There is a key phrase that can be useful when you're justifying on free response, because this kind of applies to almost any question of this sort. So let me show you. Okay, here's the phrase. The thing you need to connect is saying that the rate law from the rate determining step matches the experimentally determined rate law of the overall reaction. This is basically the key point you're trying to make if you're trying to justify why a particular reaction mechanism is valid or how you can go ahead and write the rate law of the overall reaction based on a reaction mechanism. Okay, let's take a look at what this might look like in an actual practice problem. Okay, they have given us a two-step mechanism, and notice in this mechanism they've labeled the first step as slow and the second step as fast. The slow step came first, so, well, actually it doesn't matter what order it came in. Whichever one is slow is your rate determining step, but it is convenient it came first. We'll take a look at why in just a moment, but first we need to figure out what the overall reaction is. Remember, to get the overall reaction, you're literally just adding up the two reactions together, just like Hess's law, right? Cancel out anything that appears on both sides. So A2 showed up as a product and then a reactant, but there's one of each on both sides, so it will cancel out. And then everything else is left. Okay, they want the rate law for the overall reaction. They want us to predict it based on the mechanism. Now remember that we can use the stoichiometry of each elementary step to write an individual rate law for each step. So let's take a moment to do that. Well, in step 1, remember we label that with a little k1 because it's just the rate constant for the first step. There are actually 2 A particles. So this would be squared, or second order with respect to A. And then we do the same thing for step 2. The second step just has one A2 particle and one B particle, so it's first order with respect to both. Now remember how I mentioned that it was kind of convenient that the slow step was first? Here's why. If you're trying to write the rate law for the mechanism, you have to include all the rate laws for every step up to the rate determining step. Well, if your rate determining step is first, that's the only one you have to worry about. So when the rate determining step is first, the rate law of the overall reaction is the rate law of that elementary step. The best part is that honestly, of all the AP Chemistry tested reaction mechanisms, almost all of them, like 95%, are going to have your rate determining step as the first step. Now, you still have to recognize what you're doing. Every once in a while, I think it has happened once in the past 7 years of testing, they will give you a reaction mechanism where it has a slow step in the second or third step of the mechanism. And there's still a way to solve for that, but it's a little trickier. That's what the next video is for. So in our case, predicting the rate law, well, the rate determining step was the first step, so we can just predict the rate law based on that step alone. So I predict the rate law of the overall reaction will be this. Notice there's no little subscript anymore because now it's the overall reaction, so it's not just the first step. To justify it, you do have to identify that the first step is the rate determining step, so then we can use the stoichiometry to write the rate law. And justified. All right, part C, short and sweet, says identify the intermediate in the mechanism and justify. Hopefully you realize that A2 is an intermediate. Let's see how you would justify that. Basically, you have to say something about how it was formed or produced in an earlier step and consumed in a later step. You could also note that it doesn't show up in the overall reaction. All right, that is the basics of reaction mechanisms. There is one more practice problem at the bottom of the page that would probably be a good idea to try to see if this is making sense. So if you'd like to go ahead and try this, go ahead and pause the video, and then when you are ready to check, unpause the video. Okay, for part A, you're just labeling the molecularity. Well, both of these steps have 2 reactant particles, so they are both bimolecular. For part B, well, it's more interesting. It gives you the experimentally determined rate law. And based on that, you're like, well, which of the 2 steps shown must be the slow step? Well, did you realize that the rate law that was experimentally determined exactly matches the rate law derived from step 1? Well, that means step 1 must be the rate determining step. It's just that key phrase again, right? The rate law that's derived from the stoichiometry of step 1, aka your slow step or rate determining step, it matches the rate law of the overall reaction. Well, the experimentally determined rate law of the overall reaction. I should add that. And there you have it. The next video will go into the slightly more complicated examples when the rate determining step is not the first step of the reaction mechanism. So thank you for playing with the glories of chemistry.